Welcome to Higher Ed Live, the live weekly web show about the world of higher education. It is the show all about digital development and professional empowerment. I am your host, as always, Seth Odell, and Higher Ed Live is very proudly sponsored by the guys at Integral, the creators of Schools on Facebook. Get more information over at integral.com. First off, guys, got to tell you, I know I'm having a little bit of internet lag issues. Please bear with me today. Tweet me if there's an issue. We got some kind of storm going on in LA. Weather is all crazy. So there's a bit of lag, but we're going to make it work. We are going to push right on through. So thank you guys for tuning in tonight. We are doing a big show on higher ed PR. We're talking PR tips and tricks, and I think I got the absolute single best person I could possibly have to come talk about it, and that is the one and only Josh Keller from the Chronicle of Higher Education. So right on, let me pull him right on the show. Josh, what's going on, man? Welcome to Higher Ed Live.
Hey, Seth, thanks for having me on. I appreciate it. Looking forward to it.
Yeah, I'm very excited to have you here. I think it's going to be really fun to talk about it. It's a subject that I think people are really going to be interested in, and you're the best person to talk about it. He's a West Coast correspondent, covers all sorts of stuff going on, anything college universities on the West Coast, tech, a lot of stuff. Josh is the guy to talk to on this. So, guys, we start every show, though, with something that I like to call the Weekly 5, and that's no different. Now, bear with me. Links are going to be coming out a little bit slow today. My man Nate is driving up north, getting home for spring break, so I'm handling the whole thing myself. So let's get right in to the Weekly 5. First story going on this week is Google Apps getting sued due to their NYU and one of the school getting sued due to their use of Google Apps because a lot of advocates are saying it is not accessible to blind students. You guys know a couple shows back I talked about how I felt that Google Apps was going to make a big push in higher education. This could be a really big hurdle for them now. So keep an eye on that. It's really interesting. I think more schools were looking at utilizing things like Gmail, and now the question is, can they legally, and is there going to be pushback if they do? Second article, really interesting one too. Study came out for the third year in a row saying that higher education utilizes social media on a bigger level than the top 5 Fortune 500 companies. I was kind of surprised by this. I don't know if you guys were surprised by that, but I was. So tweet me. Let me know if you guys think that this is kind of either BS or true or not. I think maybe higher ed is utilizing social media more, but at this point, the survey shouldn't be asking who's using it more, but who's using it well. I think we're well beyond the fact of just utilizing this stuff, and we're talking about actually who's doing what with it, and that's what really matters to me. But I thought it was still interesting that some folks think higher ed is ahead of the game compared to consumer products and the top Fortune 500 companies. Next story, guys. This is a really cool, interesting piece. At least I thought so. And it was just all about 5 reasons why innovation in higher ed will come from South Korea. South Korea is looking to do speed up so every household has 1 gigabyte of speed for internet, incredibly fast, way faster than what's going on in the U.S. And it's just a great article talking about why innovation is going to be coming from South Korea and Asia in general, but just due to the accessibility of high-speed internet, which is very much not accessible still in the U.S., despite what some of us think. So very interesting to think about. It put a lot in perspective for me personally when I started realizing that innovation may not be coming within our own borders, and maybe it's time for us to look overseas to see what other folks are doing. And got 2 more in the Weekly 5 for you. TED. You guys know TED Talks. I'm sure you do. Well, they launched something called the TED Ed Brain Trust this week. It's a private forum for folks in higher education to talk about, folks K through 12 as well. Sorry, K through 12 and higher ed to talk about education. I'll be honest, I'm not sure what's going to come of it, but, I do think the TED Talks can be influential. It's worth keeping an eye on. I'm going to send a link out how you guys can sign up for TED Ed yourselves. At least, lurk it, see what's going on, see the conversation. If not, join in as well. And the last, Weekly 5, I got to mention it. Did you guys see the video that came out of a UCLA student doing a rant of sorts against Asians in the library? As you guys know, I actually do work during the week at UCLA, so I'm not going to touch this, but I'm just going to say it's worth looking at as a case study of what happened, what was the response, everything else. Just go ahead if you didn't see that. I'm going to leave it right there at that. Finally, guys, each week I do something called the Unsolicited Shout Out of the Week, where I shout out any person, place, thing, or idea for any reason, pretty much because I can. It's my show. Well, this week, it is getting a big shout out to something called Formulists. And Formulists is a site that lets you build dynamic Twitter lists. And I'm not talking about like lists already built in Twitter. I'm talking about breaking down your followers by geographic region, what state they live in, what city they live in, keywords within their bios. It's time for us to get serious about Twitter. It's not enough to just have a Twitter account and blast out messages. Every alumni association should be using Formulists to build lists of alumni by state. so they can start engaging on a meaningful, local, small level. I think you guys all agree. I mean, what really matters with social media, where you get the most impact, is micro communities, getting really passionate people that have a core connection and capitalizing on that. Formulas does that. Over at HigherEdLive.com, which we'll link to via our Twitter, we put out a post telling you exactly how to use Formulists, what it can do. And I will say Formulists is not entirely free. You got 2 lists for free, but we talked to the folks at Formulists, and if you follow the link that we'll give you, you'll get an extra list on top of that for free as well. So just keep that in mind, guys. That is the unsolicited shout-out. That's the Weekly 5. And we're here now to talk about today's big topic, which is PR tips and tricks with the Chronicle of Higher Ed's Joshua Keller. So, Josh, first off, again, man, thank you so much for coming on the show. I'm really excited about it. I'm really, really happy that you're here. So thank you so much. I do appreciate it.
Well, thanks for having me on. Looking forward to it.
Cool. Now, guys, if you're watching, we do have a little bit of lag issues, but you got our audio crystal clear, so just stick with that if our lips aren't totally matched up perfectly. So, Josh, I'm just going to go ahead and start very basic as we're talking this conversation today. Do you just mind briefly introducing yourself a little bit for folks in case they're not familiar with you, the Chronicle? Let's give a background on what you are, or so who you are and what you do.
Sure. I write for the Chronicle of Higher Education, so leading news source for everybody in higher ed. I've worked for the Chronicle for about 2 years out of San Francisco. I cover the West Coast and the West, California, Oregon, Washington, Arizona, New Mexico, Nevada. Never been out to Hawaii yet, but I'm looking for the chance. I also cover tech. More recently, I've moved on to the ed tech beat, covering things like Blackboard, LMS Space, e-textbooks, and lots of great stuff happening out of Silicon Valley.
Wow, very cool. That's actually a great beat, and I got to say I'm really, really happy that the Chronicle is getting behind that beat. Talking about like e-textbooks, things like that. It's stuff that people talk about changing our industry, but it needs to get covered more. I don't think people are seeing the connection with the possibilities and the actual road to get there. So it's cool that you guys are behind that and doing that. So, guys, as we go about this today, as always, this is your show, okay? For those of you first time tuning in, I see a couple of you guys, thank you so much for watching. If you can't sit through the whole thing, we got archives at HigherEdLive.com. I appreciate it. But if it's your first time watching, know this. Every single show, it's about you guys. Use that hashtag on Twitter. You can ask any question you want, and you guys can control the dialogue. So keep that in mind. Keep the questions coming in, because I definitely appreciate it when you guys do that. So, all right, so Josh, we know all about you, but I'm going to start with the big question, which is the state of the industry. I just think as we talk today, it's good to keep in perspective both where higher ed is and where, obviously, the media industry is, and where the Chronicle will be as a media outlet that covers higher education. We all know, the folks watching the show, that higher ed is in really, really tough financial times. Obviously, things are really strained. Things are shrinking. Budgets are shrinking. Responsibilities are widening. People are, overworked, understaffed. I mean, is it safe to say that that's the same for the media industry? Everything we all see is saying that. But, what are things like now? How is it in the industry, and how different is it than just a couple years ago as far as trying to get coverage?
Well, at mainstream journalism institutions, the last few years have been really bad. I think you don't see so much of a change with places where I'm at the Chronicle or at Inside Higher Ed. You see really big changes in how higher ed is covered at mainstream newspapers, local and regional newspapers. There are just fewer reporters who know anything about higher ed, and the reporters who do are often covering K-12 and crime or courts and other things in addition to higher ed. So it's that much harder to get somebody who's knowledgeable and able to pay attention to what colleges are trying to get out.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And I think a lot of times in higher ed, if you work in higher education PR, you hear from folks, we want to get a story in the New York Times or the Washington Post or things like that. And that's a good point, this is not as beat specific as it used to be. It used to be, I think, that there were reporters for almost any beat imaginable, and then it was a lot easier to build a relationship. And now I think that's one of the key things to keep in mind is, as people's beats are widening, there's not one reporter for each beat. It's that much harder to keep a sustained relationship with them. But we're going to get into that today, because that's something that, I want to talk about. If these reporters are overworked, harder to get a story placed, how do we build relationships with them? We're going to get into all that kind of stuff, which I'm really, really excited about. So, I think one of the things I want to start the conversation with is just getting coverage. When it comes to PR in higher education, that's the thing that you're always asked to do. Can you go out and can you get coverage for us? Can you get a story placed? And that's kind of the main burden I think that falls on most higher ed PR professionals. And I want to bounce a bunch of questions off you, if that's all right, just regarding that and just to see where things are. So first things first, to get a story placed, it has to be a good news story, obviously. And what's a good news story to someone in higher ed isn't always a good news story to the member of the media that we're hoping will write a story about it, obviously. We don't write a press release unless we usually think it's good or worthy. So can we start off, my first question to you is, what makes a good story in your eyes, as opposed to ours? We're obviously working in higher ed. From the outside looking in, what makes a story newsworthy to you?
Well, it's the same. I evaluate a press release or I evaluate a pitch in the same way I evaluate whether to write a story. It has to have some sort of. It helps if it has interesting people involved. It helps if it's something happening new. It really helps if there's data or other information that can back up, if it's a trend piece, what I'm being pitched, so I can make sure that the dynamic I'm describing is actually true. So I think it's hard to summarize what makes a good news story, but if you read newspapers and if you pay attention to other outlets, you'll see what they cover and what they don't cover. It's got to have kind of an immediacy and something that people will talk about once they hear it.
So let's say you have a story idea that you and your boss or your office all agrees, okay, it's got that news value, it's broader than just our community, it's worth it. Obviously, the next step in PR is in public relations is pitching. That's the thing for folks that don't work in PR. That's kind of that's where it happens. It's you have an idea for something you think is a story. How do you get it to the reporter, get them to take the time to hear you out, and get them to believe in it? Essentially sell them on why they should take their time, write it, or go pitch to their editor why they should write it or anything else. It all kind of comes down to the pitch. So I'm going to be talking about that with Josh for a few minutes. That's kind of really, really what it comes down to in a lot of times. So I want to talk a little about what kind of pitches work. First off, just tell me broadly, what kind of pitches work, what kind of pitches don't work with you specifically, and then maybe we'll dig into some more details.
Well, I'd like to start off a little farther back, I guess, in the pitch, because if you're pitching somebody cold, if you're pitching a journalist cold, and they don't know who you are, that makes it that much harder for them to pay attention to what you're trying to tell them. If your first interaction with the reporter is your pitch, it's going to be hard. It's not impossible, but it's just going to be a higher bar for them to pay attention to what you're saying. It really starts farther back and kind of developing a relationship with that reporter over time so that you can understand what they're interested in and kind of shape your pitch based on your relationship with them.
That's a really good point, actually. Let's talk about that. Relationships is absolutely everything in PR, I think. You're right, that the cold pitch is almost impossible, unless you have something really good to stop someone in their tracks. So let's talk about what works to build a relationship. I'll just say on my side, just so folks know watching the show, you guys know my background is in marketing. Before entering higher ed, I was actually an assignment editor for ABC News in Albany, New York. So I definitely went from one side of the game to the other, and that's why I do have a love for PR. But it is because I think I understand a little bit more about reporters and what they look for and things like that. But I'm just going to share one anecdote about building a relationships that I approach, and then maybe Josh can offer some more tips to you guys. One is when I started at UCLA, I actually pulled out a piece of paper and I made a list of the outlets I want to have relationships with. And then I went and I said, okay, who are the people at these outlets that hypothetically would be covering? And I literally invested a lot of time. I went out and I followed them on Twitter. I would read their articles. And I'm not talking about spending hours and hours every day, but I kept an eye on the people that I felt were gatekeepers to the publications I wanted to be connected with. And over time, it worked. I mean, I will say that I've been able to build relationships with people that took 6 months, 8 months, 10 months to build, simply because they'd put an article up and I'd comment on it. And I wouldn't comment on it because I want them to know who I am. I'd comment because I found it relevant. But I was already reading the article. It was already there. Or I'd send somebody a note. And it worked. I built a great relationship with someone from the Huffington Post, literally via Twitter, simply by following him for about a year. And it takes time, but that's something that works. I think it's not out of the question just to make a list of here's the connections I want to have, and then slowly be patient and over time work to make them happen. But Josh, if you could give just a couple tips to people, what's something they should do if they want to try and start build a relationship with some folks in the media?
Well, I mean, building a relationship with journalists is hard because they're often really distracted people, and there's a high turnover. So it's not an easy thing to do, but it's really important. Exchange of information between journalists and sources is a two-way street. I can help give you information when you need it, and you can help give me information when I need it, and not just information that makes your institution look good, but stuff you might know about that I might not. Even if you're at UCLA and you're not telling me about something at UCLA, that's still helpful for me, and that shows that you have goodwill, that you understand what might be relevant to what I'm writing about, even if it's not trying to make your institution look good. That's the kind of thing that can help me trust you as a source over time. Is to know that you have some ability to know what's newsworthy and what isn't.
That's a really, really good point. I think people need to have perspective that in PR, it isn't just about you. The bottom line isn't just about yourself, that if you can be valuable to a reporter, then they're going to want to have a relationship with you. And I think the question is, how can you be valuable? Like you said, it's a really good point that you can feed information to someone. You can make sure a reporter knows about something, whether or not it's directly going to benefit you. Just to share one very brief example, I tell people sometimes don't pitch. A lot of times in PR, if you work in higher ed PR, you're told, like, get our faculty expert out there. But I think it's better than pitching an expert. You guys should sometimes pitch what I call is like a broker. What is a relationship you can give to the media? Do you have a faculty member who's very valuable in their field? Maybe instead of pitching a single story, just tell a reporter, say, hey, keep this faculty member in mind. He's willing to take your calls and help you with stories. Whether or not you cite him, source him, talk about him specifically, he can connect you with people. It's kind of more long-term. But I think it's a really, really good point that every interaction with a reporter isn't simply, here's a story you should cover or you shouldn't. I think it's going to be really valuable in building relationships over the long term. Very specific technical question for you, Josh. Someone's trying to connect. What platforms work to connect with people? I mean, is this something where we can follow reporters on Twitter, or we should email them, or should we just comment on their articles, or call them? Like, what is the avenue that works best for use in your personal opinion?
Well, it depends on the reporter. But for me, I think email is a good place to start. I am on Twitter, and I do probably give my Twitter messages more attention than email just because they're usually more personal. Really the difference in whether I'm going to pay attention or not is whether the pitch seems like it's been personalized to what I'm interested in covering. It's really easy to ignore a press release or some sort of form pitch that goes out to a lot of people. It's really hard to ignore an email that's addressed to me that mentions something that we might have covered in the past, and that connects it to something at that person's institution. Mm-hmm. So I think on really good pitches, I don't mind getting emailed and then called to follow up with the email, as long as the pitch is good. If the pitch is bad, a call is really annoying. Yeah. So it's really a judgment call. If you really think I should be paying attention to something and you're worried that I'm going to miss it, a call is okay. Just be careful not to burn that, because it's easy to get annoying over a pitch that's not that good.
That's a really good point. That any avenue can work. Like, sure, they should, like, okay, you might check your Twitter messages more than email, but as soon as somebody DMs you or @replies you 4 or 5 times with stuff that's not relevant, they've just burned their relationship. And that's the thing people can remember too, is that I, as much as I'm sure you get hundreds of pitches a day, over time I'm sure you do learn who's a bad pitcher. Like, if you see someone's name or institution and you know there's never any value there, it's almost that much easier than ever to scan over. And that's what's dangerous, I think, because if you're pitching stuff that's not really worth it, and then you have a really great story, well, you don't really have the attention of people in the media to kind of really think it through, because you've already kind of cried wolf a few too many times. Yeah. And that's big in PR. I know that, like, a lot of people say, they get concerned about whether or not they should pitch something. I mean, do you hear that people say, oh, I'm pitching this, but only because my boss asked me to, or I didn't want to, or things like that?
Sometimes, if I know the people, that I can get a little sense of what their work environment is like, and they tell me that they're doing something because their boss asked them to do it. And that's, you can still send the pitch and kind of let me know you don't think it's a big deal, and that's okay. But really, make sure as much as possible that the information you're sending to reporters is really relevant, because it becomes a white noise really quickly.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And you brought up one other thing I want to backtrack on just real quickly. You talked about mass pitching. A lot of folks in higher education, PR in general, use services like Cision Point or Meltwater or other things where you can distribute large amounts of press releases at a given time. You can build a media list and send it out. I will say that I personally don't use Cision. We have it. I use it as a database for emails. I mean, I'll use it as like a large phone book, so I can look up and see who's on what beat, at least within the past 6 months when it was updated. But when you send a blast press release out via those systems, at best it's going to say, like, hey, insert name of reporter here. So I'm going to very directly ask this question. If an institution is using a platform that mass distributes press releases, even if your name is included, can you as a reporter instantly tell that?
Yes. It's very obvious. Most of the press releases I get at this point have my first name at the beginning of the email, but that doesn't really mean anything. The difference is, have they done any sort of work to know what I write about? I get pitched a lot for K-12 stories. I don't write about K-12. I get pitched a lot for stories that have nothing to do with higher ed. And I think that's evidence that there's a lot of just really mass, big net pitching going on. and maybe some of that is valuable if you have real news. If you have something that you know a lot of people are going to cover because it's a big event for your institution, that could be useful. But if it's an award being given out to a student because for some reason, it's probably not the best route.
Yeah, I gotta totally agree with you. Anyone that mass blast emails, I'm sorry, those are the folks in PR that are doing it wrong. Clearly, I think. But I think it's a really good point. I will say that it's interesting when you think as a PR person, if you use something like Cision or any other distribution system, if the reporters know that you're using it, maybe you should reconsider. I personally think sending a list out to 180 people generally doesn't work. You should be more strategic. There's no reason you're not pitching to 20, 30 strategic people. Once you get to a wire service or two or some major outlets, there should be a smaller target system. But so let's talk.
See if I can go back to just the idea of relationships for a little bit. A great question that I'm asked by PR people sometimes is, what are you working on? What are you working on right now? What have you been working on? What do you expect to work on in the future? And that might not seem directly relevant to pitching me because I'm probably not working anything related to your institution. But it's really part of a kind of long-term listening process to figure out what does this reporter actually care about? What subjects actually interest them, and what are they going to make the extra effort to go out and cover? That's something where you just got to put the time in to listen to the people you want to cover your stories, so you can approach them in the right way.
Totally, I completely agree. So let's get into a little more of the nitty gritty. I'm just curious for PR folks that want to know. Is there a day of the week, time of day, anything else that's more likely to kind of get your attention when you're glancing at your inbox? Or is it just kind of free-for-all, totally depending on what you're working on?
Yeah, that really depends. Monday morning at 9:30 is probably not a good time. But other than that, it's kind of a crapshoot.
Mm-hmm. All right, and then the next one. A lot of folks say, everything is dead these days. Email is dead. Other things like that. What about press releases? I will say that I try not to write press releases whenever possible. I think it makes the most sense to write a web story and then send just a small pitch to the media, because they're not going to obviously be running your press release word for word usually. But what are your thoughts? Does a well-written press release still work for you to get you to cover a story?
If it's news, yeah, absolutely. I think a press release. The function it has for me on something that's actually news is, first of all, I can know about it and everybody can know about it at the same time. And second of all, when I'm preparing to interview somebody about the subject, I can have some background so I know a little bit about what I'm talking about before I start to do interviews. So it does serve a purpose if what you're publishing is actually newsworthy to somebody. There's just, I think the majority of press releases are just not newsworthy to anybody. And so that's where the issue comes in. I still think they still have a function.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Yeah, I think that's definitely good to hear. And it goes back to the things, people pitching large releases and pitching things as they're told to. I just think on a personal level, I'm just going to tell folks, that you need to really reconsider that if that's what you're doing. The position you're in is told to pitch things that aren't newsworthy. You shouldn't be pitching awards and announcements and things like that when they're never covered. And here's a PR tip I'll give people actually real quick. Business Newswire is a service that puts your press release out in front of the eyes of reporters. It really just dumps it into Google News, and it costs a few $100s. If you are being told, we want our press release out there, we want it out online and all these things, don't pitch it to a list of reporters you care about and water down your relationship. Use something like Business Newswire. Spend $300 or $400. Dump it out there. It'll be hosted online. You can send a link to your boss and tell them it's out there, and you've done it without kind of watering down your relationship. And technically, it is still out there and it's news, because again, I do see a lot of releases too. It's an award for this or an award for that. I just don't think that really is the way to go, obviously. So what about faculty experts? That's something that's on campus a lot. That happens a lot in higher ed. Someone asked before, how do you find out about an expert on campus? It really just depends who on campus knows what they're talking about, is really in tune with a specific industry or specific newsworthy topic, and wants to work with the media. It's kind of that, you need that whole combination. But let's say you have a faculty member that wants to work with the media, that's an expert in their field. So it's not that we're pitching a story to you, but we're telling you, like, hey, this is a really good guy to keep in mind, for repetitive stories as they go on over time. Are you open to being pitched an expert that you can go to? Is that something that people can tell you about, or is that something more so that if you're working on a story and you need a quick soundbite related to it, you can go out and find somebody on your own?
No, I absolutely appreciate that. I don't think PR people do it enough. Colleges are these incredibly diverse, interesting, exciting places. But oftentimes, the people I end up talking to at colleges are not the most exciting, diverse, interesting people on those campuses. So if you have somebody super interesting who is knowledgeable about what I cover, it has to be related. I really do appreciate being reached out to and say, here's somebody you should talk to. Here's a potential source. It does require knowing what kind of people are good sources and who aren't. You mentioned them being available. Reporters often work on a tight deadline, and so they have to be able to call you back within the same day or within a couple hours, depending on what the story is. So it does require figuring out who's a good source, figuring out what the reporter is interested in writing, and then connecting those two things together.
Very good point. And I think that I want to bring up a quick broader question too. Then it's about returning calls and stuff like that. I mean, obviously, there's kind of two types of PR. There's type where it's in the university going out and trying to get coverage, build a relationship, and there's also the media calls that come in. And that's kind of obviously the other side of the coin. That whether you're writing a story already about our institution, something that happened at our institution, or a story about something else, but you want to talk to a specific faculty member. My question is, how timely do we need to be? I mean, do you want – one thing I'll say is, I don't give out my office number. I only give out my cell phone just because I think that if someone's calling me, I want to make sure I can get it. When you're calling an institution, what's good practice as far as you're calling to write an article about a college or university? Do they need to answer the phone? Do they need to call you right back? Do you want them to email you back? I'm just curious, what's the best way we can be there to help get you the information you need in a time that still works for you?
I think I oftentimes leave messages, and it's really good to know that somebody's working on my request, and it's not just kind of hanging out there. So anyway, call or email, just even if you can't get the response yet, or it's going to take a little while, just letting me know that is really a big difference. And then letting me know there's somebody on the other end of the line there.
That's a really good point. That's a very good point. So that if a call comes in from you and you're saying, I want to write the story, even if the person's still working to track down the information or track down the expert, to just keep you in the loop and say, hey, I got your message, I'm on it. I'll reach back. What's your deadline? I'll reach back with you at a certain point. So do you just you're looking for updates so that the person's out there working, so that you kind of feel like you're not just like lost in space and the message is out there not being returned.
Yeah, and reporters call more people than they need for every story because some people aren't going to get back to you in time. So you're always calling, say twice the number of people you need for the story, and you're always kind of calculating, okay, I have this much time left. Which ones are I going and which sources of information am I going to use given what I've gotten so far? Mm-hmm. So if a PR person lets me know I'm going to get your response at 3:00, then I can kind of build that into my story, which I'm already writing, and understand that I'm going to have that source of information in time for me to include it.
All right, so next question for you. Embargoes. Are you okay with them? And in what situations do you think embargoes work and don't work? When do they annoy you, and when are they totally acceptable?
Embargoes annoy me when a reporter breaks the embargo and I'm kind of left trying to catch up with them. That's hard for PR people to prevent. But I think with an embargo, it's an agreement, and it's incredibly important to be very clear about what the terms of the agreement are. I've been in many situations where the embargo, and in general, embargoes are great. I appreciate having the time before something is announced to do research on it. So I do like the concept. It's just that oftentimes things get confused. Where is it 12 a.m. Eastern time? Is it 12 a.m. Pacific time? Is it can I publish on March 28th, or does that mean 12 o'clock in the morning, or does that mean I have to wait until 8 o'clock in the morning? And those kinds of misunderstandings oftentimes result in reporters being frustrated because they end up covering something too late because there's some sort of misunderstanding of what the embargo actually involved.
Cool. That's really good to keep in mind. So embargoes are okay if you tread very carefully and really do your best to keep a lock on everything and everyone in the loop. Like you said, you can't control everything, but that's also why I think go carefully. But if you can do it, that is true. I think reporters definitely do like the lead time, especially if it's a complicated story that's going to take them a long time to fully research, comprehend, evaluate, and write. So the next question then, exclusives. On your angle, I know in our side of things, we use exclusives in PR to get one media outlet to cover something that they probably would cover anyway, but maybe they'll give it more attention because they know they're going to have a day's lead on everybody else because they're going to be the only people that have it. That's how we view it. We view it as it's the cherry on top. It's really entices people more likely to cover something. Do you like exclusives? And if people offer you an exclusive, are you more likely to cover something?
I love exclusives. I appreciate people coming to me with information they haven't pitched to somebody else. And as long long as it's good, it will make me more likely to at least pay attention to it. Whether I cover it, ultimately, that's going to be kind of using the same calculus. And it's not at any news organization. It's not necessarily up to one person whether something gets covered. But the fact that it is exclusive will certainly make me pay more attention to it, and I think that's really a key step.
Cool, very very cool. I think so. Now if someone's pitching an exclusive, how should they do it? Should they say, I mean, do they give you the pitch and say, hey, I'm offering you this as an exclusive, or do they tell you, I'd like to offer you an exclusive around this broad subject. Let me know if you want more information. How should they technically handle it?
Either way, I think your second way works pretty well. Giving some basic outlines of the announcement, especially if there's an embargo involved, then you want to make sure the reporter agrees to the embargo before you give away all the information. I think it makes sense to do kind of a two-step process where you say, we have an announcement in this area. We'd like to offer you an exclusive. We'd like to offer you some of the information on embargo. Can you agree to that? And I can at least agree to the embargo, if not actually covering what you're talking about.
Cool. So I'm going to back up real quick, if you don't mind, and ask us the question that I'm curious about, which is as higher ed has less and less beats. I mean, as you said you cover you're the West Coast correspondent for the Chronicle of Higher Education. You're talking about covering a large area. You know, if someone has something that's very specific research, to you, what makes that news? Does it have to be news associated with a West Coast university? Will you handle a story that's nationwide, that's local? I'm just curious, you know, if someone's, again, doing like a science or an arts story that might work for you, how do they know? I mean, is it really just a matter of is it more about having the relationship with you so they can ask you and say, hey, is this something you'd want?
If you know me, then it's easy to just send me an informal email and say, hey, are you interested in this kind of thing? And if not, can you recommend somebody at your organization who is? And I will do that. So having a relationship helps. But like most reporters, I have a really high degree of latitude on what I'm able to cover. There's specific areas that I wouldn't go, but I think if I'm really interested in something, I'll probably figure out a way to cover it. So, my beat is a very general description of what I do. What I actually do is what I tend to get interested in from day to day.
That's a really good thing to keep in mind, actually, that the relationship comes first. That if you don't know if something's worthy for you to cover, because again, it's such a gray area now with budget cuts and people in media covering such broad areas. It's more about having the relationship as a foundation first, so that all it takes is a quick email. Would you be interested in this? And if not, who at your organization might. That's really, really good advice, sage advice for people to keep in mind, actually. So to step back again with another question, guys, again, if you have questions, HigherEdLive is the hashtag. My question is, let's say somebody out here is watching and they don't just work in PR. They work in marketing, communications, all these other things. A lot of institutions have smaller offices. And what if they're only pitching something like once or twice a year? Is it still just go back to the relationship? I mean, I guess it has to, because otherwise if they're just cold pitching you, it's kind of tough, right? I guess that may be more of an internal conversation.
This is really a challenge for small colleges. I mean, if you're Stanford, you're UCLA, you're Berkeley, you're going to be on a reporter like me's radar all the time. But if you're a very small college, not known that much, it's going to be tougher to do, and it's a harder job. But if the only time I hear from you is once a year, it's going to be really hard for me to know whether I can trust, your opinion of the news, to trust whether what you're pitching is actually newsworthy. So yeah, it does go back to the relationship, and I have relationships with people at smaller colleges where I've never covered anything from their college directly, but I have done coverage that is in their interests because they're able to think a little more creatively about how they can help me out.
Cool. Very cool. So one of the big trends that's going on in higher ed right now, it's really, honestly, in the web in general, is online newsrooms, sort of like a website where you can go that has faculty experts, all the press releases, all the articles, photos, things like that. You know, is that honestly valuable to you as a member of the media? One thing, we've talked about this before. Georgie Cohen, a great woman from Tufts, came on to talk about theirs, and we talked about how the online newsroom for higher ed, a lot of the audience isn't members of the media. It's just being a news portal for anyone interested in your university in general. But do you think there's also a value in having like a landing page or a website of some kind specifically for the media with contact phone numbers, faculty experts, press releases, things like that? How valuable is that to you?
I think it's required. Sometimes I go to institutions that don't have that, and I'm surprised, and it makes my job that much tougher. I use those kind of sites where there might be a listing of phone numbers of PR staff, there might be a feed of recent press releases, and there might be an expert directory of people I might talk to. That's really helpful to me. and it makes my job a lot easier. And if there's an archive, it means that if I'm covering your enrollment numbers for 2011, I can go back and maybe see how they compare in 2010, 2009. So, I'm almost surprised at this point when institutions don't have really press-focused website where they make that information clearly available.
That's really, really good to know. So, I mean, it's a must now, guys. We already heard from Georgie that it's a must on a community level. It's a must now if it works for people like Josh too. And that's a good point, that it's just about having instant access to information. Like a lot of places I've seen schools have news sections that have the About Me section, like so where they just a list of stats. Here's our latest enrollment numbers. Here's our actual cost to attend. Things that you might be referencing in a piece where the story is not about your students, but you want to know how many students do you have, how many undergrads do you have, how many degrees do you offer. Things that are very valuable to just plug in as these pieces of information into a broader story, but aren't worth spending a half hour trying to call somebody to get that information. So that's definitely good to know. I want to ask you a question about multimedia. There was this trend a couple years ago about the social media press release. Everybody thought that was the big thing. I don't think it's ever taken off, obviously. But what is your approach and thoughts on things like YouTube videos? I mean, is the Chronicle or you or broader media question even open to embedding videos from an institution or embedding photos or linking to them? Or is this something where you really only want, the only content you obviously want in your article would then be just from you guys specifically?
No, I mean, I think we will embed anything that is of interest to our readers, and I think that's true of any news organization. I think newspapers and other news organizations have gotten a lot more flexible about what they're willing to include as their own content, and they've figured it out that embedding other people's content is actually really valuable, as it is on the rest of the internet. So we routinely post embedded YouTube videos from institutions as long as we think our readers are interested in them. We just post the UCLA Chancellor's response to that student who had the rant about Asian students on our blog, and we gave that much more coverage because it was a YouTube video than we would have if the Chancellor just released a statement.
That's a really good point. So, and that keeps in mind too then for folks in higher ed to think about and understand that the information you share needs to be able to be taken off your site. This is a very old school web thing. I think most schools have moved beyond it, but there has been a sense of ownership of content. Schools wanted the video on their site. They wanted the information on their site. But it is really good having it, for instance, a YouTube video where people can take that and go with it. We've had success. I've had success personally getting coverage by having people embed a YouTube video. Again, we've had the New York Times link to our videos before, a YouTube video, because if you can offer it as an extra to the story, it only benefits their readers too. So it is sort of a win-win, and it's something to keep in mind. So, guys, again, if you have questions, send them in. I'm going to ask you a very technical question about pitching, if that's cool. Sure. There's kind of two things I think that are needed in the pitch, and that is, an email and a phone call. If it's really newsworthy, let's say you already have somewhat of a relationship, it's already newsworthy. Does one need to come before the other? Is this something where someone should be emailing you and following up with a call? If so, does it have to be immediately after so that way you can actually reference it so you haven't gotten 50 press releases since then? What do you think works best?
An email, clearly explaining what the story is about. Give me the lead. Give me what you think the lead of the story would be if I wrote about it in my newspaper. It's probably not going to be the same, but at least approach it from the journalist's perspective as opposed to the institution's perspective. And then a listing of people who might be available to talk about the subject in the pitch. Some sort of reference to why it matters in some sort of broader context beyond that institution. And then if it really is a good pitch and it's worth it, a phone call sometime during business hours, explaining, making sure I saw the email, and explaining why it's important.
Very good to know, guys. I think this is important. A lot of times it's those logistics that people forget about. I hope folks take some of this stuff away today. Like the big ones I love is that members of the media know when it's a mass email, even if their name's included in it. They know when it's not personalized, and knowing when to call, when to follow up. And I guess the big thing, though, when we're talking about this stuff today, it is that it's not so much about these small technical things. It's really the big picture. It's about having, one, relationships, and two, understanding what is a valuable news story to the members of the media that you have relationships with. That's really kind of the big thing, I guess. And that puts a lot of pressure on us internally, guys, in higher ed. And I think we need to take that on and say that whether it's a boss saying it's newsworthy or faculty saying it's newsworthy, what it comes down to is, do we think the members of the media think it's newsworthy? And you can always post stories on your online newsroom. We have those, and if just because news isn't of value to a certain media outlet doesn't mean that it's not valuable to your audience. And that's why you have your own website, you have Facebook, you have Twitter. But when you go to have a relationship with a member of the media, I think it's important that you take their criteria for news and apply it to the story you're working on. That's a really, really good point to take away. I hope folks realize that. That's really valuable, I think. So if one question for you, let's say somebody just met you on the street and it was their first day in PR, very first day. What advice would you give them starting out totally cold turkey, not having any background in the industry?
Well, you mentioned it a little bit before. Make a list of outlets that you think would benefit your institution. Make a list of the people at those outlets who you think are writing the kinds of stories that you would want. Over a period of time, read those people's work and figure out what they like, what they're interested in, what their hobbies are, what they don't like, what they seem to get annoyed about. And then reach out to them with something. Maybe it's just a link to a piece of information that's completely unrelated to your college, but reach out to them in a way that makes them understand that you appreciate what their job is a little bit. I think kind of having that broader sense of being able to have that broader directory of people you can go to is really going to make a difference, because even if you have a good pitch, not all of your pitches are going to get covered. But you can at least increase the likelihood by having a good set of people you can go to.
Yeah, that is some really, really great advice. I hope folks are taking it today, guys. I've honestly learned a lot. I've been working in PR for several years, and I'm still taking away that I don't think you can ever undervalue, the relationship. I guess
I would add that there's a kind of a second part here, which is how much do the PR people know about their own institution, and how much access are they given to the discussions about what's actually going on at the college or whatever organization it is. The people who are really helpful to reporters know what's going on. They don't have to give me a call back every time I ask them a basic question. And sometimes they even know a lot about what's going on. It can provide background about things that haven't even been announced yet. I know that's not always up to the individual person how much access they get to that information, but it really makes a big difference in how effective they are in my eyes, whether they have access to the information and are able to provide it, even if it's on background. A knowledgeable source is just far better.
That's a really good point. So so PR folks need to remember that they are, as well as the story they're pitching, they are a source to you, and they need to have that information. You're right. So I think one thing I've witnessed too, is that when the call comes in and someone needs something, and okay, I got to call you back, and they call you back, and then the reporter asks something else. Okay, I have to call you back. I agree. You have to have someone on the phone who can answer these questions openly, honestly, who's a spokesperson for the campus, allowed to be and speak openly. That's tough. I know. I agree, though. I think that's something that falls on the university internally. But speaking as a PR person in higher education, I'd say, guys, if you work in any level with the media, just have these conversations with your supervisors, with the people in your office. I think a lot of times people will understand this if you just explain it to them how PR works. I think what happens is you have folks that don't understand how PR works saying, send out press releases, that's how you get coverage. And I think if you maybe take the time to have a conversation around that, maybe you will get that extra bit of freedom to take those leaps, to stand out on your own. And then you can also do the legwork to have a real solid knowledge of what's going on campus. Because, I'll admit too, guys, in higher ed, this is crazy, but we've gotten calls before from reporters saying, what do you have going on? There are lulls. There are summer, if it's a higher ed reporter. There are times when there's holidays. Understand that there are times when they might come to you even to say what's going on, and you need to know at all times. Well, actually, have you one other question? I would say this: are there times of year when stories are more valuable? I would say I worked in TV news, obviously, and I would say state holidays were the slowest day. If you wanted to get covered on a state holiday, you could get covered for anything practically because nothing else was open and it was really easy to pitch. Now that's TV news, but is there ever a time of year or a day when, if folks are smart enough, or for instance, even just pegging a story to a holiday or to a national trend, are there things like that can kind of jump out and get attention, a lot more than others?
In higher ed, it's in the summer. That's the lull. And so it's going to be really hard to pitch something the first week of the semester, even though that might be when you're thinking about it. That's when everybody's pitching things. So the summer is really the time when there's the least amount of stuff going on, and we as reporters have to stretch the most in order to find interesting stories. I have spent a lot of time discouraging PR folks from what they shouldn't do. But I really want to emphasize that reporters are always looking for good information. They're always looking for good stories. Their job depends on their ability to find good stories. And so I don't want to emphasize too strongly that if you have something you think might be interesting, it's better to pitch it than it is to not. And so definitely err on the side of getting it out there.
That's a great point. So now let me ask you, then let's dig into that a little bit specifically. Let's say I have a story that I think you might be interested in, but I'm not sure. So you're saying, pitch me anyway, I want to know. Now, if that's the case, do I tell you that in my pitch? I mean, are you saying like I should send you an email or something that says, hey Josh, I'm not sure if you'd be interested in this, but here's what's going on, 3 sentences. If you are interested, then follow up. You just kind of
absolutely. I love it. I love it when people are honest about what they think and honest about whether they, how highly they value the story. Like I said, it's just a great question to say, is this of interest to you or anybody else in your organization? And then we can work from there. Whereas if you send it just as a press release, I probably wouldn't respond, and then you would never get that information back.
That goes again back as always to the relationship. That's a great point. That if you send the press release to that story we're not sure you're interested in, you never cover it, and we never know. But if we email you and say, would you be interested in this? You might respond and say, no, but there is this person at my outlet that sometimes is interested in that, but they more so like it when it's A or B or C. So what you're actually doing is you're refining your ability to pitch rather than blindly pitching and never getting a response. That's really, really good because there's a lot of folks I think that have stories that are on the line. They don't know if it's newsworthy or not. And if they know that, hey, maybe I can email and just ask, that does in the long run benefit you too, because you're not getting all these blind, press releases just dumped in your inbox. You're getting pitches that are being filtered specifically for you. So that's a really, really good point, that you can filter your pitches by reaching out to members of the media and just asking them when you have a story that may or may not fit, if it does.
Yeah, it's analogous kind of to fundraising in some ways. There's this idea in fundraising that you shouldn't spend most of your time asking people for money. You should spend most of your time building your relationship with them and then only ask when they're ready. It's not quite that much based on the relationship between reporters and their sources, but it's the same general idea. If the only time I ever hear from you is on your pitch, I'm a lot less likely to listen to what you have to say.
Great. So now, guys, we are wrapping up the show just about now. We've been talking higher ed PR with Josh Keller from the Chronicle of Higher Education. Josh, I want to ask you one more question just because I'm personally curious.
Sure.
As more and more higher ed institutions are utilizing social media, more and more of them think it's newsworthy every time they do something with Foursquare or Twitter or anything else. As a tech writer, where do you see social media being a story in higher ed, and where do you see it just being something that every institution's trying and it's not newsworthy? Because I just have a feeling there's a lot of PR offices around the country where the boss is saying, hey, we're using Twitter in a cool way, you should pitch that. Or, hey, we're using Scavenger. But, obviously, as we heard a few weeks ago, a lot of schools are using Scavenger. So, at what point does the use of social media rise to being newsworthy, and how much of the times do you think it's not?
That's a great question. And absolutely, there's tons of pitches about uses of new media that are not, that are supposed to be newsworthy just because they involve some form of media, but they're not. The difference is it's newsworthy when you can connect it to a story of success. It's newsworthy when you can show some data behind what you're doing to demonstrate that, yes, absolutely provable, what you're doing is actually helping you out, or what you're doing is actually helping somebody out. It's not news to just say we're on this channel. It's news to say we're on this channel and we've directly linked that back to the fact that we got X new applicants, we've gotten X new donations. That kind of final link, that kind of being able to show with data where the success is often the difference between what's newsworthy and what isn't.
Awesome. That's a great point to end on today, I think, Josh. That's a really good point for folks to keep in mind. We talk about this stuff a lot on the show, so it's good to know when we think it is and isn't newsworthy. Guys, I just want to thank you all so much for watching today. It's been a really, really great time. I'll tell you, before I let Josh do his last takeaways, my takeaways are really, it's about relationships. Be strategic. I think you can make a list and who you want to have relationships with and work on it slowly over time. And then work with that member of the media to filter what works for them and what doesn't. Because it is really, once you have the relationship, you have the door open. Then you can ask, what works for you? How do you want to be pitched? Is this news or not? You can't do any of that if they don't know who you are. But Josh, thank you again, first off, so much for coming on the show today. This has been absolutely loaded with information for folks working in PR and higher ed. I can't thank you enough. Do you have any last-minute takeaways or anything else that you want folks to keep in mind, take note of before we sign off today?
Well, thanks for having me. I really appreciate it. Enjoyed the discussion, and I love the show, so glad to be on it. I think you summed it up pretty well. Reporters are distracted oftentimes, and they're skeptical by profession. But if you kind of break through that initial skepticism to the point where you actually become a real person to them, you're a lot more likely to get through. You just have to establish that, get through that initial skepticism so that they can actually hear what you have to say.
Awesome. Josh, again, I can't thank you enough for coming on. And guys, thank you so much for watching. This is going to do it for us here at Higher Ed Live. You guys know you can follow HigherEdLive.com. We have a newsletter over there. We have a big giveaway, giving out 2-day-long tickets to the EDU Guru Summit that's happening this week. In tomorrow's newsletter, go sign up today, HigherEdLive.com, for a chance to win. That's several $100s worth of prizes. And please don't forget that next week we have an amazing show with FIU's Betsy Solar, one and only, talk about Tumblr. Tumblr in higher ed is a really interesting topic because Tumblr is not just a blog platform, it's a social network too, and many schools have not figured out how to do it yet. I'm telling you right now, Betsy's figured out how to do it, and she's going to share with us her tips, her tricks on how to get it done. Come back next week, HigherEdLive.com. Until then, and until next time, thank you so much for watching. As always, Higher Ed Live, sponsored by Integral, the creators of Schools on Facebook. Thank you guys. I will see you all next week.